There are things the Gambino crime family did that even their own soldiers were not supposed to talk about. Not the big assassinations, not the courtroom trials that splashed across the front pages of every newspaper in New York. Those stories became legends. Those names became famous. Everyone knows about the bosses. Everyone remembers the public executions, the flashy mobsters, the dramatic trials. But the real story of organized crime, the darker story, lives in the events that were never supposed to be remembered. The quiet ones. The ones where nobody powerful died. The ones where the victim had no bodyguards, no connections, and no one important asking questions afterward. Tonight's story is one of those. It begins on a quiet street in Queens, and it ends with a body in a mortician's bag in the basement of a candy store. Wednesday, April 29th, South Ozone Park, Queens. The afternoon looked ordinary. Parked cars lined the street. A few people walked along the sidewalk. Spring sunlight reflected off the windows of small neighborhood buildings. Nothing about the scene suggested that one of the most brutal killings connected to the New York Mafia was about to begin, and the man at the center of it all had absolutely nothing to do with organized crime. His name was William Chacon. He was 36 years old, a carpenter by trade. Investigators would later describe him as a troubled man who struggled with mental illness. He had been arrested a few times in the late 1960s on minor drug charges, but those incidents were years behind him. For more than a decade, his record had been clean. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't an informant. He wasn't someone the Mafia had any reason to notice. But on that Wednesday afternoon, William Chacon walked too close to the wrong place, at the worst possible time. Because just a few feet away, one of the most powerful men in American organized crime was stepping out onto the street. His name was John Gotti, and in 1987, John Gotti was at the absolute peak of his power. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand who John Gotti was. Gotti had grown up poor in the South Bronx. One of 13 children. Money was always short. Opportunity was almost non-existent. But ambition was everywhere. By the time he was 16, Gotti had dropped out of school and was already running errands for the Gambino crime family. At first, the jobs were small. Stealing trucks, running illegal gambling operations, collecting debts for men who didn't like to be told no. But Gotti had something many mobsters didn't: charisma, confidence, and a willingness to take risks that frightened even hardened criminals. Those traits helped him rise quickly through the ranks, and by the early 1980s, everyone in New York's underworld knew his name. But the moment that changed everything happened on a cold night in December 16, 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. That evening, the boss of the Gambino family, Paul Castellano, arrived for a dinner meeting. He stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car with his underboss, Thomas Bellotti. They never made it inside the restaurant. Gunmen stepped out of the shadows. Within seconds, Castellano and Bellotti were riddled with bullets. It was one of the most brazen mob assassinations in American history, and everyone in the Mafia world knew exactly who had ordered it: John Gotti. The hit had been organized with military precision. Multiple teams, perfect timing, no witnesses willing to talk, no arrests that night. When the smoke cleared, John Gotti became the new boss of the Gambino family, the most powerful crime organization in the country. But Gotti didn't behave like a traditional mob boss. Most Mafia leaders preferred to stay in the shadows. They avoided cameras. They kept quiet. They dressed modestly. Gotti did the opposite. He wore expensive suits. He gave interviews. He smiled for photographers. The media couldn't get enough of him, especially after something remarkable began happening in court. Case after case against Gotti collapsed. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence fell apart. Jurors returned not guilty verdicts. 3 major trials and 3 acquittals. Reporters began calling him something that would follow him for the rest of his life: the Teflon Don. Because nothing ever seemed to stick. By 1987, Gotti ran his empire from a modest social club in Queens, the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club. From the outside, it looked harmless, just another neighborhood club. Inside, it was the nerve center of a criminal empire. Folding chairs, a small television in the corner, old men playing cards. But behind those ordinary scenes, millions of dollars moved through illegal businesses every month: loan sharking, gambling, construction rackets, extortion. Every major decision passed through that club, and every man who walked through its doors understood something very clearly. You were standing in the presence of a man capable of ordering someone's death with a single sentence. Among the many men who served John Gotti, one stood out, not because he was loud, not because he chased attention, but because of his reputation. His name was Joe Watts. Most people had never heard of him, and that was exactly how he liked it. Watts wasn't even Italian. He was of German descent. In the strict traditions of Cosa Nostra, that meant he could never officially become a made member of the Mafia, no matter how loyal he was, no matter how dangerous he became. But the rules of organized crime have always been flexible. When someone proves useful enough, Joe Watts had been killing for the Gambino family since the 1970s. By the time Gotti rose to power, Watts already had a reputation that made even hardened mobsters uneasy. According to later testimony from informants, Watts had been responsible for at least 30 murders, 30 lives erased, 30 families left without answers, and somehow, almost nobody outside the underworld even knew his name. When Paul Castellano was murdered in 1985, Joe Watts stood nearby as a backup shooter. If anything had gone wrong with the main hit teams, Watts was there to finish the job. That loyalty earned him something extremely valuable. After the assassination, Gotti handed Watts the loan sharking business that had once belonged to Castellano's underboss. The operation was worth millions. Overnight, Joe Watts became incredibly wealthy, but more importantly, he had something far rarer than money: John Gotti's absolute trust. When Gotti needed a problem solved, Watts handled it. When someone needed to be threatened, Watts delivered the message. And when violence was required, Joe Watts was the man who made it happen. On April 29, 1987, that violence would fall on a man who had absolutely no connection to the Mafia. A man who had simply walked too close to the wrong street, at the wrong moment, because at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, John Gotti stepped out of the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club, and seconds later, a loud bang echoed through the street. At first, witnesses weren't sure what it was: a car backfiring, a firecracker, or something far worse. But inside the Gambino world, even the possibility of danger to their boss triggered an immediate reaction. Gotti's men moved fast. They began scanning the street, looking for anyone suspicious, anyone who might have fired a weapon, anyone who might have threatened their boss. And unfortunately, one man happened to be standing nearby: William Ciccone. Within moments, Gotti's crew became convinced that Ciccone had fired at their boss. There was just one problem. There was never any proof he had. But in the world of the Mafia, proof was often unnecessary. Suspicion was enough. And once suspicion fell on you, there was usually only one outcome. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon in South Ozone Park, Queens. The sun hung lazily in the sky. Birds chirped. A light breeze rustled the leaves along the sidewalks. To anyone walking these streets, it was just another ordinary spring day. But for William Ciccone, nothing about that afternoon would ever be ordinary again. He was 36 years old, a carpenter by trade, a man whose life had been simple, repetitive, and by the world's standards unremarkable. He had no enemies. He had no debts with dangerous people. He had no connection to the violent underworld of New York's organized crime. And yet, That day, the streets of Queens were about to intersect with a world Chacon was never meant to enter. A loud bang shattered the calm, a sound that could have been a backfiring car, or a firecracker, or something far worse. The men standing outside the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, the nerve center of the Gambino family, immediately reacted. Years of training, loyalty, and fear coursing through their veins. Every motion precise, every glance calculated. William Chacon, oblivious to the danger, was standing nearby. According to later investigations, something as simple as being in the wrong place at the wrong time would seal his fate. In the eyes of the men inside that club, suspicion was enough, and suspicion was lethal. Within seconds, a group of men emerged. The street, quiet moments ago, erupted with movement. They cornered Chacon. Hands grabbed him. Voices barked orders. Feet shuffled. He tried to resist, but he was outnumbered, overpowered, overwhelmed. In a matter of moments, he was shoved into the trunk of a car. The world he knew, the world of carpentry, of small-town life, of quiet afternoons, slid away with the closing of that trunk. For Chacon, the car was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a vessel to an unknown fate. The drive was tense but methodical. They crossed through familiar streets over the Goethals Bridge, heading toward Staten Island. The city, with its chaos and noise, seemed distant now. In the back of that car, Chacon had time to realize he was entirely alone. Not in the sense that no one was there. No, he was surrounded by men, powerful and violent, whose loyalty to the Gambino family was absolute. But in the sense that no one in the world he knew, no friends, no family, no police officer, was coming to save him. It was a realization that weighed heavier than the metal of the car doors. Outside, the streets continued their indifferent life. Cars drove by. Pedestrians walked without noticing the dark drama unfolding a few blocks away. The city had its own rhythm, its own pulse, and it paid no mind to one man's terror. And inside the trunk, Chacon was learning the most brutal lesson of all. In the world of John Gotti, mistakes, or even perceived mistakes, were punished without question. Eventually, the car stopped. The men emerged. They moved with purpose. There was no hesitation, no conversation, no debate. Chacon was lifted from the trunk, and then he was taken into a building. The location was nondescript. A warehouse-like structure, dimly lit from the outside, anonymous to anyone passing by. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the echo of heavy footsteps and the soft creak of doors opening. This was the world where Joe Watts thrived. The world where loyalty, fear, and reputation were more important than life itself, and William Chacon had just crossed its threshold. For hours he was held there, not minutes, hours. The men of the Gambino family worked with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Every movement calculated, every action deliberate. The purpose? To extract information, or perhaps to assert power, or perhaps to punish for a perceived slight. The specifics, the exact words, the questions asked would never be fully known. Because in the underworld, silence is as important as loyalty. But what happened during those hours would define Chacon's fate. It was in that warehouse, in the hands of men like Joe Watts, that suspicion became judgment, and judgment was final. Outside the building, the city continued. The sun dipped lower in the sky. Cars drove past. People chatted on street corners. Life carried on. No one could see the terror, the fear, the helplessness of the man inside. Because in the world of organized crime, only what is necessary is visible. The rest happens in shadows. By the time the afternoon had passed and evening approached, one thing was certain. William Chacon would not leave that building alive. The next steps were calculated, cold, and deliberate. And the man waiting to carry them out was Joe Watts, a man whose reputation was built not on rumor, not on talk, but on action. 30 confirmed hits, decades of experience, loyalty to John Gotti above all else. And now, Chacon was in his hands. The story of that day is not about heroics, it's not about survival, it's about how an ordinary man can be caught in extraordinary circumstances, how a simple misstep, or mere presence, can bring the full force of a criminal empire down upon you. And for William Chicone, there would be no escape. The warehouse was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, makes your heart beat louder, and leaves you wondering if the next sound will be your last. William Chicone had no way of knowing what awaited him. The men who had taken him had worked with precision, moving silently, efficiently, leaving nothing to chance. And at the center of it all was Joe Watts, a man whose reputation preceded him, not because of what people said about him, but because of what he did. 30 confirmed hits. A career in organized crime that stretched back decades. A man feared even by those who called themselves mobsters. Watts didn't need to speak to assert dominance. His presence alone commanded attention. And now, he had Chicone completely under his control. The room itself was unremarkable at first glance. Dim light hung from the ceiling. Shadows stretched across the walls. The air smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and something more sinister, an indefinable tension that seemed to thicken with each passing second. A simple table, a few chairs. That was all the setting needed for the horrors about to unfold. For hours, Chicone would be held there, his world shrinking to the walls of that warehouse, the faces of men who had the power to end his life in a single moment. We will never know exactly what was said during those hours. The questions, the threats, the demands. Only fragments remain, reported later by law enforcement and informants who survived to speak. It is enough to know that Joe Watts conducted his work with a methodical precision. There was no panic, no shouting, no losing control. Only quiet, cold efficiency. Outside the warehouse, the world continued. Queens carried on as if nothing had changed. Children played, neighbors chatted, cars passed along the streets. But inside, the ordinary world was gone. Time had been suspended. Every second mattered. Every breath was measured. Chicone's life had become a countdown, and Joe Watts, standing over him, was the final arbiter of that clock. Watts had earned his reputation the hard way. A man of German descent in the Cosa Nostra world, he was not Italian. He could not be made. He could not hold formal rank. Yet he had risen higher than most men who bled the same blood as the Mafia founders. How? Skill, loyalty, fearlessness. He understood one thing in the world of organized crime: perception is reality. If people fear you, respect you, obey you, you are untouchable. Chicone, standing powerless in that room, was about to learn what that meant in practice. Hours passed. There was movement, but not much. Footsteps, the occasional murmur, a sigh, and then the moment came, the act that turned suspicion into tragedy. Watts raised his weapon. 6 shots, precise, unrelenting. Chicone never saw it coming. His life, measured in moments like any other man's, ended in seconds. The work was not over. The body, lifeless but still a tool of influence, was placed in a mortician's bag. A chilling ritual in the language of the underworld. Every action, every placement, was a message, not just to outsiders but to those within the organization. Power, respect, loyalty, all communicated silently through these acts. The city, unaware, continued its routine. Queens was oblivious to the violence that had touched one of its own so intimately. Joe Watts, after completing the task, did not linger. There was no celebration, no conversation, no hint of regret. Just another day's work in a life defined by control, fear, and absolute obedience to John Gotti. Watts had proven once again why he was trusted above almost anyone else in the organization. For Chicone, the warehouse would be his last memory. For the men outside, the event was a demonstration of power. For the city, it would remain largely invisible, another secret, carefully hidden, that even the most diligent investigators would struggle to piece together for years. And yet, This is how the world of organized crime operates. Ordinary people can be caught in extraordinary circumstances. Ordinary streets can become arenas for extraordinary violence. Ordinary afternoons can end in tragedy when the wrong men wield the wrong kind of power. Joe Watt's reputation only grew after that day, not because anyone celebrated him, not because newspapers reported it, because in the shadows, the story mattered. To the people who needed to know who could be trusted, who could enforce loyalty, who could execute orders without question. Watts was that man, and in this world, that meant everything. The abduction, the holding, the execution, these were not random acts of violence. They were carefully calculated moves in a game of power, respect and fear, and the victim, William Chicone, was caught entirely by circumstance. Not a gangster, not a rival, not someone with enemies willing to protect him, simply a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. When law enforcement eventually pieced together what had happened, they were horrified. The warehouse, the hours of captivity, the precision of the execution, all spoke of a system of violence far beyond what the average citizen could imagine. And yet, within the organization, it was normal, routine, expected, because in the Gambino family power demanded respect, and respect sometimes required blood. The streets of Staten Island were calm that evening. The kind of calm that lulls you into a sense of security, the kind that makes a sudden event feel all the more jarring. But for William Chicone, the calm of the city was meaningless. His life had already ended in the quiet of a dimly lit warehouse. What remained of him, the body, was about to be used as a message. The mortician's bag, heavy and unyielding, held more than just flesh and bone. It held power, it held fear, it held a warning. The men who carried it knew exactly what they were doing. Every step, every turn, every choice of location was deliberate. In the underworld, even a body can speak louder than words. The destination was a place few would suspect, a local candy store in Staten Island. Paul's Sweet Shop, a family-run establishment, ordinary to anyone passing by, would soon become part of the Gambino family's language of intimidation. The building itself was unremarkable, a small brick storefront, glass windows revealing shelves of sweets, the faint aroma of chocolate and sugar wafting into the street. But that ordinary setting would be transformed. Inside, the bag was placed carefully, almost ceremoniously. It was not done in haste. It was done with intention. Joseph Lefort Sr., a man described later by investigators as a captain in the Gambino family, had orchestrated the placement. His sons, James and Joseph Jr., were involved in the operation. The act was both punishment and instruction, a reminder that disrespect, disobedience, or failure to follow the family's code had consequences. In the world of organized crime, the location of a body can be as important as the act itself. Outside, the streets remained indifferent. Pedestrians walked past, oblivious. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The sun dipped toward the horizon. Inside the candy store basement, however, the air was thick with something darker than sugar. Fear, power, authority. A simple location had been turned into a statement. This is who is in control. This is what happens when rules are broken, and everyone who knew the family understood the message immediately. The body of Chicone lay silently, a tragic symbol of consequences that were both random and calculated. He had no connection to the family, no reason to be there. Yet, his mere presence on the wrong street at the wrong time had made him a part of a larger story. One that few would ever hear, one that spoke to the reach of the Gambino family's power. Investigators pieced together the scene later, painstakingly connecting bloodstains found near the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club to the body in the candy store. DNA science in 1987 was limited, but the evidence was enough to confirm that Chicone had been tortured, executed, and then used as a tool to communicate dominance. Joseph Lefort and his sons disappeared soon after the act. Police could not locate them. They were not victims, they were avoiding questions. The message had been delivered. The work had been done. And the family had no interest in witnesses. In the world of organized crime, survival often depends on knowing when to vanish, when to observe, and when to avoid scrutiny. For Chacon, there was no survival. For the Lefort family, the candy store became a stage. For law enforcement, it became a puzzle, a dark piece of evidence that took years to fully understand. And for the city, it was an invisible thread in the tapestry of the underworld, one that would remain hidden from the public eye for nearly a decade. The story of the body in the candy store is not just about death. It is about control. It is about power. It is about a world in which ordinary people can become instruments of fear without ever knowing why. And it is about a family that communicated with actions rather than words. William Chacon, 36, carpenter, mentally troubled, entirely unconnected to the criminal underworld, became a symbol of what happens when the machinery of organized crime moves, when its cogs, like Joe Watts, are set into motion. His life ended not because of a choice he made, but because of a system that required obedience, fear, and absolute respect. And yet, even in death, Chacon's story would not remain buried. It would surface through investigators, through court documents, through informants who dared to speak years later. Because in the world of organized crime, secrecy may reign, but the truth eventually finds a way out. The candy store basement, once a place of sugar and childhood delight, would forever be etched into history as a scene of tragedy, a place where the life of an ordinary man intersected with the extraordinary power of the Gambino family, a place where fear and authority were communicated silently, yet unmistakably. The act was a lesson, not to the public, not to law enforcement, but to those within the organization. Every move, every placement, every carefully chosen location told a story, and that story was clear. John Gotti's reach was absolute. Joe Watts executed with precision, and anyone who failed to respect that power, even unknowingly, would face the consequences. The city would eventually move on. Paul's sweet shop would continue selling candy. Children would still walk past, unaware of what had occurred beneath their feet. But for those who knew, the message was clear. A body could speak louder than words, and for William Chacon, it had spoken his fate in the most final, irrevocable terms. For nearly a decade, the murder of William Chacon remained a ghost. A secret buried in the shadows of Queens and Staten Island, whispered about only in the corners of the underworld. No arrests, no headlines, no justice. It was as if the city itself had turned a blind eye. But secrets, especially those soaked in blood, have a way of surfacing. And in this case, the man who would finally break the silence was someone who had lived within that world, a man who had seen the machinery of the Gambino family operate from the inside. His name was Dominic Borghese, known in the family as Fat Dom, a soldier in the crew of one of John Gotti's most trusted lieutenants. He had attended weddings. He had been in rooms where decisions were made. He had seen bodies buried, both literally and figuratively. He knew the rules of the game, the cost of disobedience, and the price of speaking out. For years, he kept his silence. Loyalty, after all, was paramount. Obedience was survival. But in 1995, nearly 10 years after Chacon's murder, something changed. Borghese began cooperating with federal prosecutors. The reasons were complicated: fear, pragmatism, perhaps a desire for redemption. What mattered was that the story would finally emerge. Through Borghese, investigators learned the horrifying details of that April afternoon in 1987. The abduction, the hours in the warehouse, the torture, the execution, and the meticulous placement of Chacon's body in the basement of Paul's sweet shop. For the first time, law enforcement had an insider, a man willing to recount the inner workings of a criminal empire from the inside out. Borghazi's testimony painted a picture of an organization operating with precision and terror. John Gotti, the Teflon Don, was not just a figurehead, he was a strategist, a leader who demanded absolute obedience and respect. And Joe Watts was Gotti's most reliable instrument of violence. The stories Borghazi told were chilling in their clarity. Hours of meticulous planning, execution carried out with precision, and bodies used as tools to enforce loyalty. It was not chaos, it was order. A hierarchy maintained through fear, authority, and absolute control. The details were staggering. Ciccone had been abducted on suspicion, held for hours, and tortured. Watts had carried out his orders with methodical exactness, as he had done countless times before. And the placement of the body in the candy store was no accident, it was a message. The Lefort family, Joseph Sastre and his sons, were warned. Observers within the organization understood immediately this was the cost of failing to show proper respect. The act, brutal as it was also symbolic. Power in the world of the Gambino family was absolute, and every action reinforced that reality. Borghazi's cooperation changed everything. His willingness to speak provided law enforcement with the roadmap they needed to piece together the events of that day. For the first time, the mystery of Ciccone's death began to unravel. Names, places, actions, timelines. The silent machinery of murder, control, and intimidation was exposed. The implications were massive. Joe Watts, the feared enforcer, could now be held accountable, not just for Ciccone, but for the broader network of violence he had enabled. And John Gotti, already a notorious figure, faced yet another layer of scrutiny. The underworld's secrets, once buried, were now in the light of legal inquiry. Borghazi's testimony also highlighted the human cost of this power. William Ciccone, a man entirely disconnected from the criminal underworld, had been caught in a web of fear and authority he could not understand. The average citizen would never have seen it coming. And that is precisely the terror of organized crime. It is indiscriminate. Its rules apply not only to those within its world, but to anyone who happens to cross its path. Through Borghazi, law enforcement could finally connect the dots. The abduction, the torture, the execution, the message sent via the candy store, and the chain of command leading directly to the highest levels of the Gambino family. Every piece of evidence corroborated by an insider's account. Every unanswered question finally given context. The mob, once shrouded in impenetrable secrecy, now had cracks in its armor. The stories of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances were no longer silent. The machinery of fear, power, and loyalty, the world that had claimed William Ciccone, was now on trial in the court of law and public consciousness. Borghazi's courage in speaking out did not erase the tragedy. Ciccone was still gone. His life ended in violence, his story nearly lost to history. But through testimony, investigation, and documentation, his death became more than just a secret. It became evidence of the reach and brutality of organized crime, and it became a warning that even the most carefully hidden acts could eventually be revealed. For law enforcement, Borghazi's testimony was invaluable. It provided clarity. It gave direction. It exposed the inner workings of an organization that had thrived in silence for decades. For the public, it offered a glimpse into a world most would never experience, but whose consequences could touch anyone at any time. And for the underworld, it was a reminder that loyalty, fear, and authority were fragile. Even the most feared enforcers, even the most untouchable bosses, were not invincible. The nickname, Teflon Don, had once seemed untouchable. John Gotti, the Gambino family boss, had walked out of federal court 3 times acquitted on serious charges. Nothing stuck. Every headline, every investigation, every attempt by the law to pin him down, he had somehow slipped through. The world watched in fascination and fear. A man who appeared untouchable, unstoppable. But the Teflon was not permanent. Every empire, no matter how powerful, has a breaking point. For Gotti, that point began to emerge slowly, quietly, and inexorably through the men around him, the very system that had once protected him. It began with testimony. The whispers of insiders, the courage of informants, the cooperation of men like Dominic Borghese started to unravel the threads of the Gambino family's power. No longer were the murders, the abductions, and the acts of intimidation confined to shadows. Now they could be documented, questioned, and cross-examined. Joe Watts, Gotti's most feared enforcer, had always been untouchable. 30 confirmed hits, decades of violent service, loyalty to Gotti above all else. But even Watts would eventually face consequences. The law had a way of waiting, watching, and striking at the right moment. For Gotti, the cracks in his armor became impossible to ignore. Sammy, the Bull Gravano, one of Gotti's trusted lieutenants, made a decision that would change everything. He turned informant. A man who had been at weddings, at meetings, in the inner rooms of the Gambino Empire, now spoke openly with prosecutors. Everything he had seen, heard, and helped carry out, every act, every order, every murder, meticulously recounted. The underworld's secrets were now exposed. In federal court, the fall of the Teflon Don was both dramatic and inevitable. Gotti, once untouchable, was convicted on all counts. Life in prison. The power he had wielded on the streets of New York, the fear he had inspired, the influence he had commanded, it meant nothing inside the walls of a federal cell. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Complications from head and neck cancer. 61 years old, the Teflon had come off. The empire he had commanded had crumbled. And yet, his legend remained. A man remembered for his audacity, his style, his ruthlessness, and his rise from the streets of Queens to the pinnacle of organized crime. Joe Watts' story followed a similar arc. Even after Chicone, even after decades of service, the law eventually caught up. In 2011, at 69 years old, Watts pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiracy to commit murder and assault charges in connection with the 1989 murder of Frederick Weiss, a sanitation executive. The act had been ordered by Gotti. Watts had organized the hit team. He had waited in a garage on Staten Island, weapon in hand, ready to enforce Gotti's will. Though the intended victim that day did not appear, the following morning another team carried out the murder. For Watts, it was the beginning of the end. Judge Colleen McMahon described Watts as a cold-blooded killer during sentencing. "He apparently does not know how to live without violence and killing," she said. 13 years in federal prison. Watts, like Gotti, would face the finality of justice in the system he had long eluded. The fall of these men marked the end of an era. The streets of New York would never be the same. The social clubs, the secret meetings, the silent enforcement of fear, all were disrupted. The power of the Gambino family, while still present, was diminished. And the stories of men like William Chicone, the ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, were finally recognized. Chicone's name, once lost in the shadows, now appeared in court documents, grand jury indictments, and media reports. A reminder of the human cost of organized crime. The quiet lives appended, the streets of Queens and Staten Island that had witnessed unspeakable acts. And the truth that could not be hidden forever. The Teflon Don was gone. The enforcers, the loyal soldiers, and the silent witnesses, some imprisoned, some cooperating, had ensured that justice, however delayed, arrived. It was a reckoning years in the making. And for those who lived in the shadows of the Gambino Empire, it was a warning. Power is fleeting. Fear is temporary. Loyalty has limits. And even the most untouchable man eventually falls. In the end, William Chicone, 36, carpenter, mentally troubled, a man who had no place in the world of organized crime, was part of that reckoning. His life ended unjustly, But his story would not be forgotten. Through law enforcement, through witnesses, through the unraveling of an empire, the truth had finally emerged. And the world saw, in stark relief, the consequences of absolute power and unchecked violence. Justice may have been slow, it may have been sideways, but it came. And the fall of the Teflon Don marked the final chapter in a story of ambition, loyalty, fear, and the extraordinary cost of crossing the wrong men at the wrong time.